The Nile River, flowing through northeastern Africa into the Mediterranean Sea, is one of the longest rivers in the world, though its title has been debated in favor of the Amazon. Spanning about 6,650 kilometers, 4,130 miles, its drainage basin encompasses 11 countries, including Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, and Ethiopia. The Nile serves as a vital water source, especially for Egypt and Sudan, supporting agriculture and fishing. Despite its length, the Nile is relatively small in terms of water volume compared to other global rivers. The Nile has two principal tributaries, the White Nile and the Blue Nile. The White Nile, originating from Lake Victoria, is the longer of the two, while the Blue Nile, beginning at Lake Tana in Ethiopia, supplies the majority of the water and silt to the downstream river. The rivers converge in Khartoum, Sudan, before continuing their journey north. The White Nile primarily flows through Uganda and South Sudan, whereas the Blue Nile flows through Ethiopia and Sudan, contributing significantly to the water system, especially during the rainy season. Historically, the Nile was crucial for the development of Egyptian civilization and the Sudanese kingdoms. The river's annual flooding provided fertile soil for agriculture, with most of Egypt's population residing along the riverbanks. Notable cultural and historical landmarks of ancient Egypt, such as the pyramids, are located near the Nile. Today, the river continues to be a lifeline for millions of people in Egypt and Sudan. The Nile's etymology is complex, with its name evolving from ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Latin terms. In ancient Egyptian, it was referred to as Hapi or Iteru, meaning river. The Arabic names An-Nil and En-Nil, commonly used today, derive from the Latin term Nilus and the Greek Nailos. Additional theories link the name to the indigo dye plant, or a Semitic word for river. The White Nile, originating from Lake Victoria, passes through Uganda, forming significant landmarks like Ripon Falls and Lake Kyoga, before flowing through the Murchison Falls and into South Sudan as the Bahr al-Jabal. In South Sudan, it converges with several rivers, including the Sobat River, which contributes to its flow. The White Nile also passes through the vast swamps of the Sud, where much of its water is lost to evaporation. In Sudan, the White Nile joins the Blue Nile at Khartoum. The river follows a distinctive path, characterized by a series of cataracts, as it flows northward into Egypt. The Blue Nile, originating from Lake Tana in Ethiopia, provides the bulk of the Nile's water, especially during the Ethiopian rainy season, contributing to the river's seasonal variations in flow. Once the Nile crosses into Egypt, it passes through the Aswan Dam, where its historic flooding has been controlled since 1970. North of Cairo, the river splits into two branches, the Rosetta and Damietta, forming the Nile Delta and ultimately emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. The delta is one of the most fertile regions in Egypt, contributing to the country's agriculture. Sediment transport along the Nile varies across its different sections. Studies show that the river carries significant amounts of suspended sediment, particularly near cities like Aswan, Beni Suef, and Sohag. This sediment has historically enriched the soil along the riverbanks, benefiting agricultural practices. The Atbara River, also known as the Red Nile, is a significant tributary of the Nile, originating in Ethiopia. It flows only during the rainy season and dries up for part of the year. The Blue Nile, another major tributary, supplies most of the water and sediment to the Nile, playing a critical role in the river's seasonal flooding and sediment transportation. Other tributaries of the Nile include the Bahr al-Ghazal and the Sobat River. While the Bahr al-Ghazal drains a large area, much of its water is lost in the swamps, contributing only minimally to the Nile's overall flow. In contrast, the Sobat River significantly adds to the White Nile's discharge, particularly during the flood season. Historically, the Nile had another tributary known as the Yellow Nile, which once connected eastern Chad to the Nile River Valley. Its remains, now known as the Wadi Hua, represent the ancient path that contributed to the Nile system during the Holocene period, around 8000 to 1000 BCE. The importance of these tributaries highlights the complex hydrology of the Nile, sustaining life across vast regions of Africa. Foru. The Nile has played a crucial role in shaping Egypt's civilization since the Stone Age, serving as a lifeline for its population. In ancient times, the Nile followed a different course through Libya and into the Gulf of Sidra. However, after the last ice age and rising sea levels, the river shifted to its current path. This climatic change contributed to the formation of the Sahara Desert around 3400 BCE. The Giza Pyramid Complex, once adjacent to a Nile branch that no longer exists, benefited from the river's higher levels during the African humid period. Over the ages, the Nile underwent various evolutionary stages, including the Miocenian, Eonile, Paleo-Nile, Proto-Nile, Pre-Nile, and the Neo-Nile. These phases reflect different geological periods, with satellite imagery revealing ancient dry riverbeds that once carried Nile waters. During the Miocene period, when the Mediterranean Sea dried up, the Nile carved a deep canyon in Egypt. This canyon was later filled with sediment when the sea refilled. Lake Tanganyika, one of Africa's Great Lakes, once drained into the Nile, making it longer than it is today. The current Nile formed during the last glaciation period, and archaeological sites like Afad 23 highlight its ancient history. There are differing theories about the age of the integrated Nile. One suggests the river system is relatively young, while another proposes it has been fed by tributaries from Ethiopia and other regions for millions of years. Rift systems in Sudan, such as the Melut and White Nile rifts, were once separate closed basins before tectonic activity and sediment deposition connected them, forming the modern Nile system. The Nile's integration during wet periods allowed its tributaries like the Atbara and Blue Nile to join the main river, forming a unified system. Around 12,500 years ago, during the African humid period, the Victoria Nile connected to the larger Nile, creating a continuous waterway from Central Africa to the Mediterranean. The Nile was central to the rise of Egyptian civilization, providing fertile land through its annual floods. Ancient Egyptians cultivated crops like wheat and papyrus and engaged in far-reaching trade, helping secure the country's prosperity. The river was not only vital for agriculture, but also held spiritual significance, as Egyptians believed the Nile was connected to life, death, and the afterlife. The Nile's cycles influenced the ancient Egyptian calendar, dividing the year into 3 seasons: Akhet, flooding; Peret, growing; and Shemu, harvest. Water buffalo and camels, introduced by Asian and Assyrian traders, were essential to Egyptian agriculture. The Nile also served as a critical transportation route, facilitating the movement of people and goods. The quest to discover the Nile's source captivated European explorers for centuries. Although ancient civilizations like the Greeks and Romans speculated about its origins, it wasn't until the 19th century that British explorer John Hanning Speke identified Lake Victoria as the source of the White Nile. Despite controversy with other explorers like Richard Francis Burton, Speke's discovery was eventually confirmed. Modern exploration of the Nile accelerated with the Ottoman conquest of Sudan and Egypt's push to control the region. In the 19th century, expeditions reached deeper into Africa, eventually mapping the river's major tributaries. By the mid-20th century, the Aswan Dam was built, transforming Egyptian agriculture by controlling the Nile's floods, though it also altered traditional farming methods. The Nile remains essential to the people living along its banks, supporting agriculture, transportation, and livelihoods. However, challenges such as droughts have severely impacted the region. Despite numerous reservoirs and dams, recent droughts in Ethiopia and Sudan have led to widespread famine, underscoring the vulnerability of the Nile basin to climate variability. The Nile has been a vital force in shaping Egypt's civilization since the Stone Age, providing sustenance and enabling population growth. Initially, the river followed a different route through Libya into the Gulf of Sidra, but changed course after the last ice age due to rising sea levels. This shift also contributed to the formation of the Sahara Desert around 3400 BCE, leading to the development of Egypt's major cities along the Nile. The Giza Pyramid complex once stood beside a branch of the Nile that disappeared after the African humid period. Over millennia, the Nile experienced different phases, such as the Miocenian Eonile, Paleonile, and Neo-Nile, each corresponding to geological changes. Satellite imagery has revealed ancient riverbeds, evidence of a once different landscape where the Nile flowed. During the Miocene period, the Mediterranean Sea dried up, causing the Nile to cut a deep canyon into Egypt's terrain, which was later filled when the sea refilled. Lake Tanganyika, once flowing into the Nile, extended the river's reach, while the current Nile began to take shape during the last glaciation period. Archaeological finds like Afad 23 offer insights into the river's ancient history and its role in early human settlements. The formation of the modern Nile is debated. One theory posits that the Nile system is relatively young, while another suggests it has been fed by Ethiopian tributaries for millions of years. Tectonic activity linked the Nile's separate basins, such as the Melut and White Nile rifts, creating a more unified system during periods of wet climate, particularly around 12,500 years ago, when the Victoria Nile connected to the main river. The Nile played a central role in the rise of Egyptian civilization by providing fertile land for crops such as wheat and papyrus. The river's annual floods made the surrounding land ideal for agriculture and trade, establishing Egypt as a prosperous nation. Spiritually, the Nile was seen as a bridge between life and death, with Egyptians believing the river had a divine connection to the afterlife. The Nile's seasonal cycles also shaped the Egyptian calendar, with three key seasons: Akhet, flooding; Peret, growing; and Shemu, harvest. Water buffalo and camels, introduced by foreign traders, further aided agricultural productivity. The river served as a major transportation route, enabling long-distance trade and the movement of goods and people. European explorers, captivated by the mystery of the Nile's source, searched for centuries. British explorer John Hanning Speke discovered Lake Victoria as the White Nile's source in 1858, though this sparked debate with other explorers like Richard Burton. Ultimately, modern mapping and expeditions during the Ottoman Empire's expansion deep into Africa provided more understanding of the river's tributaries and ecosystem. In the 20th century, the construction of the Aswan Dam transformed Egyptian agriculture by regulating the Nile's annual floods. However, this also altered traditional farming methods, and today the river remains a lifeline for the region's inhabitants. Despite modern infrastructure, challenges like droughts in Ethiopia and Sudan highlight the Nile's vulnerability to climate change, with severe impacts on local populations and agriculture.